maybe the first question would be just to ask you about your background, both education, professional, even where you're from, your family background or something.
Well, let's see. I don't know if I know that much about those things, but when I was in Arndesrepper some 2 or 3 years ago, the first time, there was a whole family of brothers that were absolutely certain that I'm one of their brothers that nobody knew about.
Okay, that sounds almost
So,
Icelandic,
so perhaps yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's perhaps I'm Icelandic in some way. I don't know, but uh, but in this life, at least, I was born in Canada, and I have the normal speckled education. The education that is questionable value. I have that one. And then I
Yes.
have I have the informal education that is priceless. I'm lucky enough to have this one. And I had an undeclared apprenticeship with an old storyteller when I was in my early 20s,
Okay.
which helped balance out going to Harvard. That was a good balance because Harvard was over declared and my apprenticeship was undeclared, so I broke even more or less on that arrangement.
Oh yes.
And let's see, I wanted to be a priest. It was very mysterious, but I had never been to church. So, I mean, never been to church. So it was a very peculiar desire because it didn't come from any direct experience. But
Yeah.
somehow, I guess from a very early age, I had a sense of maybe purpose, you could say. And then I spent the first, I don't know, 25 years of my life trying to figure out if there was such a thing as a purpose to life, especially a particular purpose to why you were born or I was born or so on. And I probably worked very hard at trying to understand if there could be such a thing when I was in those days. And the old man that I was an apprentice to, he was a thief. And he was a very good thief too. He was,
Okay.
yeah, he was a master practitioner of tragedy. And it was a beautiful education, but it was very ramshackling education at the same time. And
Yeah. Yeah.
when I call him a thief, I mean he sort of reached into my life and stole from me any ability I would have had as a young man to be angry and withdrawn and feeling like there was no reason, there were no good examples, there was nobody to trust, there was, all of that whole misanthropic dilemma. He stole that from me and he did not replace it with anything. So the result was that I went into my 30s and into my marriage and fatherhood and so on with a sense that I could not abandon, that life was urgent. It had this quality of urgency about it. And I was lucky that I had that because I'm not sure if I was left to my own choices, what would have become of me. But
Yeah.
as it's happened since, I eventually ended up in working in sort of the counseling business generally. And I realized that this is a morally bankrupt arrangement, the kind of generic psychological counseling thing. But
Hmm.
I learned something very valuable about the encounter with people. And just at the end of that time, I was encouraged to consider working in the what I've called the death trade, taking care of people who are dying.
Yeah.
And that began maybe, I'm going to guess, maybe 18 years ago, something like that, or 20 years ago. And it was in that arrangement, working at a hospital and so on, that I discovered two things. First of all, that I would never be a company man. I would never be able to work for anyone.
Hmm.
Um, it's a terrible. I have a terrible affliction. I have no ability to bullshit, you could say. And
Yes.
then the other thing I realized is I had some almost natural ability to sit with strangers who are dying and make myself useful. That happened almost immediately with no training in particular. I don't recommend such a thing, but in my particular case, it was it was gold. Yeah, and this was, like I said, maybe 20 years ago, and two things happened there. One of them was I realized what I was born to do, and the second thing is I realized that the place I was doing it was, it had no moral, principled spine to the enterprise. It was all customer satisfaction, and it was a terrible, terrible charade. So I realized I was not going to last very long because most people believed in it that I was working with, and I did not. So sooner or later, I knew the axe was going to fall, and it did. But before it did, I learned a lot, and I ended up writing about these days in a book called Die Wise, and I called the book A Manifesto for Sanity and Soul, which are two things that were missing when I was there, sanity and soul. And more recently, I've traveled on the road with that book for quite a long time and did a lot of training inside the business, and eventually with, as you say, ordinary scholars like yourself and myself, and all over the world, really, starting in about 2010 or so. And the National Film Board of Canada made a film about me during that time. So that's lent a kind of phantom credibility to me. And then more recently, I began to be very concerned about the inclination that I saw that older people had, basically to abandon young people entirely to the what's coming. And I found this so regrettable and so cowardly that I began to gather myself around another writing project, and it turned into a book called Come of Age. And that came out a year ago. So I've been on the road all over the world with that. Just recently, 2 weeks ago, came back from Istanbul teaching about these things. And at the same time, if you can believe it, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to turn 65. And of course, at 65, they say you're supposed to begin to relax and not be so serious about life or whatever the program is. And I did not receive the email to this effect. So I have failed to relax. And as a result of that, I have a rock and roll band that's been touring in Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania, Canada, the United States, the UK. And I think next week we're coming to Iceland to do a couple of shows, myself and the band. And it's the most mysterious thing, this thing about having a band when I'm basically a shy person and not that interested in performing. It's a very peculiar combination. And I realized when I was describing it the other day that I probably have a lot in common in this project with the function of you pronounce it for me, SKAELD. Skeld, I don't know how you say it.
Skeld.
Yeah.
That's, you can use it about ordinary poets. And, Icelandic conceptions of poetry are probably a little bit wider than in the Anglo-Saxon world, probably. So, apart that could be do as well. Yeah.
So this is what I think I'm doing. I think I have this function in this particular show. We call the show Nights of Grief and Mystery. So it's kind of entertaining, but much more importantly, it's deeply concerned about the times that we're in, and it addresses these things dramatically, poetically, mythologically, humorously, and tragically all together. Yeah, so it's a beautiful evening, in other words.
Great to have the humor there, that's that sounds wonderful. So, you already probably to some extent answered, the second questions, just to shortly explain your ideas, that are more or less about death, which is most people would find really scary.
Yeah. Well, understandably, that's the first thing to say. I mean, the things that I talk about are not designed to make sure you're not afraid to die. if you're not afraid to die, I don't think you understand anything at all.
Yeah.
So the fear is not the problem. The problem is the unwillingness to die during the time that you wish you weren't dying. This
Yeah.
is kind of like being pregnant and not wanting to be pregnant at the same time.
Yeah.
You can imagine that if you don't want to be pregnant, there's real consequences for the pregnancy.
Yeah.
Obviously there is, and for the child in question and so on. So if you take the same example and you apply it to dying, you could say there's a lot of consequences for refusing to die while you're dying. And the consequences, you as the dying person don't live many of them. Most of the consequences, they show up in the lives of your family and your friends and so on. And you have all the responsibility for generating these consequences, but you don't have to live any of them.
Mm-hmm.
So this is fundamentally morally irresponsible to come to your death so belligerently, so hostilely, and then live none of the consequences of what you've put out into the air. You see, because when the younger people are watching you die, if you're an older person dying, they're learning a lot of life lessons from you. It doesn't matter that you're not instructing them, but by your example, you are instructing them. And the principal thing you're instructing them is, one, that this death is yours, you own it, you can do whatever you want with it, which is demonstrably false. And two, that you have no obligation to it, that it's a kind of victimizing vampire or some kind of demonic visitation or some gross transgression, of the natural order of things, that kind of combination. Or that you pretend you're a Buddhist and you pretend not to care at all, and you pretend it's nothing, which is a lot. It's very much a very big deal, dying. And so, there's volumes to say about this, but the short version could tell you is something like this. Dying is properly the place where your humanity finds its deepest and last articulation and manifestation. And if you disregard that opportunity, then there's a direct consequence for your capacity to be human and for the small village of people around you, for their capacity to be human as well. So there's an awful lot at stake in how you die. And so I think demonstrably, it's important that at least North Americans, which is the only place I can really talk about with authority, that North Americans begin to realize that they have an enormous moral obligation to death, and to do it well and to do it wisely, and to come to it as a kind of course, challenging and of course terrifying, but also as a kind of strange deity that you never suspected was there. It's a kind of a strange God. It doesn't really mean you harm, but neither does it mean you well. But we could say in English at least, that there's no question that it means you. In other words, there's no question that your dying is secretly somebody else's and they've got the paperwork wrong. Your dying is your dying, and it's entrusted to you in the same way that your life energy and your body are entrusted to you, in the same way that your corner of the world in Iceland and my corner here in Eastern Ontario, they're entrusted to us to take care of them and to do so honorably, and to pass it on to the next generation in a better condition than we received it. See, so this is the way I understand what dying asks of us.
So you should be, in a way, preparing your death all your life.
That's what your life is.
Your
life is practice.
Yeah.
And the way you practice it is, during the course of your life, you lose things, right? Things disappear. People go away. Divorces happen. Jobs disappear. People build dams on old rivers,
Mm-hmm.
and they flood places, and it's gone forever. And things of this kind are all, among other things, practices for your little opportunity when it's your turn.
Yeah, yeah.
So as long as we don't understand preparing to mean that you're above it, that it has no consequence for you because your insurance is, you have a certain guarantee, because you've studied it and so on. Really and truly, like I worked with maybe, I don't know, 800 or 1,000 people who died.
Yeah.
And during that time, and I'm often asked this in interviews, I was working with people who were strong Christians, or they were strong Buddhists or Hindus or whatever. And people would ask me in interviews, so the people who had a strong faith, they must have had a better death than the people who didn't. And I would generally say, no, that's not what I saw.
Yeah.
And it's very mysterious, because you would expect that if you have a firm kind of belief, then this is a good antidote, good medicine for the end of your life.
Mm-hmm.
But it almost never worked out that way. And here's why: because most people's beliefs, religious or spiritual or philosophical beliefs about dying, none of them come from the realities of dying.
Okay.
See what I mean? They come from elsewhere. They come from ideas and concepts and experiences in your life, but none of them include your death.
Yep.
And really, the only real, quote, preparation is the one that you have available to you when the realities of death are upon you. I'll give you a little example. Years ago, at the end of one of the talks I did, a woman in her probably mid-50s, she came to me at the end and she said, well, this is very good, but it's not very useful to me. I said, okay. And she wanted to argue, but I didn't argue with her. I said, okay, fine. She said, well, would you like to know why? I said, well, I think you're going to tell me, so go ahead. And she said, well, it's because nobody close to me has died yet.
Okay. Yeah.
So here's what I said to her: get closer.
Okay. Yes.
You
Yeah.
see what she was confessing?
Yes.
That she was distant from people.
Yep.
And that was her solution.
Yeah. So this is some kind of detachment. And well, I'm in my early 60s, and I'm already joking a little bit with my kids about my death. Hey, I got 7,000 books. I better register them, so that you can make some use of them, when I'm dead. I'm telling my grandkids stories about my reality, growing up on a farm up north, something that's totally alien to them, and what? No TV when you were growing up? And so I'm trying to share with them some realities that they don't know, and in my mind, I'm always, this is a kind of my preparation, I think, so these ideas, they really, I really like them.
Well, I'm glad you do. As far as this idea of preparation goes, maybe at least in English, it's not a very useful word or understanding of it. And here's why: because if you think of it as preparation, then you imagine your death to be in the future.
Yeah.
I mean, it stands to reason that you wouldn't even think twice about it. But if you think about it, just in the examples you gave me with your kids and your grandkids, what's happening there is that your death is absolutely present, because that's what's prompting you to say these things.
Mm-hmm.
You're not saying them in the future. You're not thinking about them in the future. You're saying them now, because in those moments, you're entirely inhabiting the inevitability of your death. So when are you doing that? And the answer is right now. And so the next thing to do, the obvious next thing to do, is start looking around your house like this for stuff you want to give away and start giving it away and watching it go out of your house instead of putting people's name on it and waiting till you're dead and then they take it.
Yeah.
And then it becomes a little bit more real yet, and better practice for everybody else, you see. So the point of my observation is that your death is present. It's not in the future.
Yeah.
The event is in the future, but all its meaning, all its consequence is now.
Yeah. And this then probably leads to the next question, that, you know, this is all about death, but in reality, probably not less about life, you know, a way of approaching life.
Sure, it's a distinction I can't make.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
I don't find it a useful distinction to make.
Yeah.
I mean, death is about life, of course.
Yes.
And the best way I've ever found to give a feel for that statement is this: you grew up on a farm. I have a farm right now, and you and I both know that everything that we are trying to help live, whether it's sheep or barley or, in my case, corn, and whatever it is, all of this we plant in the ground. So how do you get the ground? Where does the dirt come from? And the answer is the dirt is everything that didn't live forever.
Yeah.
That's what it is, right?
But at the same time, it's alive, you know. There are lots of life in the dirt, you know.
And not quite. Just hear me out for a second and just imagine this. So, so there's the dirt, everything that didn't live forever, everything that failed at eternity. And everything that's alive has its life rooted in that death.
Yeah.
So literally on the farm, if you do not have death, you will never have life.
Yes.
Because life is not life-giving. Life is consuming.
Yeah.
All the time consuming. Consumes sunlight, consumes nutrition from the ground, consumes your labor on its behalf. And it's death that gives life a chance. It's everything that died before you giving you this moment. And of course, that's true biologically and metabolically, but it's equally true mythologically and poetically and religiously. And of course, the very simple Christian example, the Jesus example, is an example of that very thing. Right? It was, I mean, without all of the story around his death, you don't have that religion.
Yeah.
So
right.
It's a very good example of that kind of thing.
Yeah. And well, this leads to a kind of an idea of wholeness, continuity, context, you know, being a part of some bigger context, isn't it?
Yes, with the following caveat that it's really important, to me it is, that we understand constantly that dying is not a temporary, momentary interruption in that continuity. The continuity is inconceivable without all of these endings.
Yeah.
This is what can confound the mind a little bit. We both agree that there's continuity in the story. Yes, of course there is. But the continuity is not rooted in everything lasts forever. The continuity is rooted in nothing lasts forever.
Yeah.
It suddenly becomes very mysterious. How does that give you continuity? And the answer is, to my mind, the answer is, well, if nothing escapes dying, if nothing escapes ending, then this is where the real continuity is to be found. That everything that was alive before me gives me this moment, this condition of life. And my responsibility eventually is to join that. Right now, I'm a beneficiary, right? And when you're on the farm and you go down in your field and you take something and you put it in your mouth, well, this is not symbolic. There it is. The whole story is there, right? And when you're slaughtering the sheep in the fall and you're smoking their legs in the smokehouse and so on, or you're fermenting the shark or whatever you're doing, these things are all predicated on those lives ending. And the really important thing, and I guess the challenge for your grandchildren, is if they don't live and see this every day, and they live an urban kind of virtual existence, how will they understand their obligation to finally participate in endings by ending themselves? How do they get a chance to see this in anything other than a philosophical way? And the farther we are away from the natural order of things, the more urban we are, I think the more challenging it becomes to be gathered into the story instead of watching it from a distance and only wanting to be fed by it.
This actually leads to two of the questions that I wanted to ask. One is a little bit banal, probably, because what I've been reading of your interviews and material tells me that this is a kind of a very comprehensive view or ideas or set of ideas. But I can't see, and I'm just as an ordinary scholar in humanities, I don't see any connection or context with any known thinkers. It simply appears like you're totally independent of the entire history of ideas.
Well, I think you know in your heart that that's impossible, right? Because there's nothing new, of course. Here's a story that might give you a feel for things. By the way, I take this as a compliment, what you've said, whether you mean it or not. As a compliment.
It is a compliment, yes.
Okay. So a couple of years ago, we were on with the band. We were on the road. We were being interviewed about this show. We're like, what is it? Is it like country music? Is it, is it techno music? What is it? And of course, I was never going to answer in those terms, but I was trying to find a way to not be totally frustrating to the guy. And as I was thinking about it, it suddenly hit me. I said to him, the reason that you don't recognize what we're doing is not because it's so new that it has no precedent. No, you don't recognize it because it's so old. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, I think this is what it is. The Greeks seem to have been the ones that gave the Western world the understanding of theater, the formal arrangement of theater, excuse me, and the kind of philosophical orientation to life, which is theatrical. And how did they do that? Because Western people love the notion that the Greeks invented theater. Well, they certainly invented it for the West, but how did they do it? Well, I think they did it by collapsing things, not by creating things. And I think they collapsed two things. One is that they took the ongoingness of ritual and turned it into a script where the mystery of ritual turned into the predictability of the script. And the other thing they did was take away most of the participants from the ritual and turn them into an audience who no longer participates, but only observes. See, and then I said to him, so I think what we're doing is older than theater. What we're doing is ritualistic, and it's remembering a time when there was no such thing as an audience, and there's no such thing as a guaranteed outcome or even a plot. This was all observable only in hindsight, only after the fact. So I suppose if that's true, it makes us on the stage something, I don't know if you know the word sacerdotal. It's a Latin-derived word. It kind of means priestly. But I suppose this is our function, really. And is to enact the ceremony and to invite the gods and the dead and so on to appear in our midst and to participate and to be kind to us for a little while, as we might benefit from their understandings and their wisdoms and so on. That's literally what we do. And mostly I'm telling stories, and there's some songs that are sung. That's it. So I tell you that story to say that what's actually true is the stuff that you've read that I've written is memory. It's not innovation.
Yeah.
I haven't invented anything.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember a time that's much older than I am. It's a real challenge, but it's not imagining. It's not fantasizing. It's a rooted kind of disciplined inquiry. I think that's what I do, and some people find it useful.
Yeah, in a way, you are reaching behind then kind of an intellectual detachment by the Greeks.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
That's very true. Before there was detachment, there was tragedy. And before there was tragedy and comedy, there was mystery.
Yes.
And I think I'm in that realm of being mystified.
Okay. Yeah. That.
You understand what I mean, eh?
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah. This sounds good. You also speak. The most useful thing I managed to read was an interview with the Sun.
Oh yeah.
It's a long interview.
Yes.
And there was such a lot there that really, I could connect to. And the other question that came to my mind that you mentioned, about urban kids, how to connect with them, and of course your ideas are very, very strong cultural criticism, criticism of shallow Western or American culture, etc., etc., and then you could ask, how can you reach alienated, detached, urban kids?
Okay, well, if I had the guaranteed answer for that, I would have millions and millions of dollars by now, wouldn't I?
Yes.
Okay, but I think I have an idea about it, and it's an indirect idea. That is, it's something like this. The time that I was born in does not exist anymore. The world that I was born into, the sense of possibility that I was born into in the late 50s, in the mid 50s and late 50s, it doesn't exist now for anyone, but certainly not for people who are, let's say, 25 or 30 years old and younger. That was never there their entire lives. So what that means is it is impossible for them to occupy the same world that I was born into.
Right.
Okay, so from that point of view, it's equally impossible, I think, for anyone my age to, by virtue of their memories of their childhood, somehow magically relate to young people simply by remembering their own childhood. If anything, those memories will drive those kids further away from you.
Yes.
Because your memories are their ghosts.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is what you remember literally doesn't exist anymore. And if you talk about it with young kids, as there was a time when you felt that if you studied and you worked hard enough, then you could have real consequence in the world. These kinds of things.
Yeah.
If you're alive in the 60s at all, and you have a sense of, the memory of that kind of cultural movement and sense of possibility. I mean, these kids don't have this at all. So you're talking about this with them, imagining that you're encouraging them. That's not what you're doing. You're haunting, that they were born at the wrong time. You see?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the background to the circumstance of the distance between the generations. So to my mind, the responsibility of, if I may include you in this, given your age, we're basically the same age, that our responsibility to people 1/3 our age is to conduct ourselves today genuinely knowing how bad it is, and especially how bad it's going to get.
Yeah.
And if we don't live understanding that and acknowledging that, we're betraying them. And here's how. Do you remember I said that the old storyteller was a thief, what he stole from? Okay.
Yep.
So we have an obligation, I think, to imagine such a time. Let's imagine 40 or 50 years from now, when people are living even longer, well into their 90s, perhaps by then, even in their hundreds easily. And they're taking pills that allow them to live almost indefinitely. That's not science fiction. That's probably coming within 2 generations.
Yeah.
Those people who are alive then are going to believe involuntarily that life has always been as it is for them right then. And some part of them is going to desperately want to believe or to imagine that it was not always like this, and that there were people who saw what was coming and decided to live in such a way that their example would be available to people 2 or 3 generations from now. It's not going to change anything now. What's happening is going to continue to happen. What's worsening will continue to get worse. I mean, we could go into detail, but I think between the ecology of the circumstances and the world economics and the sort of globalization of the thing, I mean, it's unquestionable to my mind that things will get worse. So people are going to want to know, was there anyone, as things were worsening, who lived their lives not trying to just benefit it, while they still could, just to fill their pockets or retire, just take care of themselves, or you understand what I mean, or buy a motorcycle or something like this. Okay, so that's what I think our responsibility is. It's not really for this moment. It's to imagine that somebody's going to need an example of what real human beings did when our capacity to be human began to be compromised. Deeply compromised. Yeah. So that's what I have in mind, and that's why I wrote the Come of Age book the way I did. I mean, a lot of older people dislike me intensely for that book. I hear from them all the time. They come to things that I do. They walk out halfway through, and they're doing so because they came wanting to be recognized as legitimate elders. You see in their culture, and they wanted the official shirt and the nice, you know what I'm saying, and the nice recognition and all of that stuff, and they wanted me to give it to them.
Yeah.
And all I could say is, look, there's more of us older people than there's ever been in the world before.
Yeah.
Okay. And if life experience was the same thing as wisdom, then the Western world should be the wisest place that the world has ever seen, because there's so many old people there.
Yeah.
Okay, but what is it actually? Is it a place of unbounding wisdom? And the answer is, are you joking? Of course it isn't. It's a catastrophe.
Yeah, right.
Okay, it's a catastrophe that's going to continue after your death and my death.
Yeah.
It will get worse no matter what you or I do. Okay, so then you realize that life experience is not the thing that makes people wise.
Yes.
Because enough life experience could traumatize you just as easily as it could make you wise. And so we have to begin to craft an understanding that there's a difference between just being around a long time and having a wisdom that's useful to people younger than you.
Yeah. Somehow turn your life experiences into wisdom.
Just not as a teacher, but as an example.
Yeah.
The world doesn't need another teacher. God knows. I mean, it's enough already with the gurus and the teachers and the workshops and the retreat centers. It's just enough. Jesus. So what we need is people who are living the life not teaching people how to live the life.
Yes, yes.
You know, and this is I count myself as enormously lucky when I was a young man that I saw this man, the way he lived and the way he carried himself. I had one living human example that I could not argue against.
Yeah, yeah.
And to this day, 40 years later, that's extremely powerful presence in my life ongoingly. Because this man never taught a thing. I mean, he never did. He simply lived his life and told the stories that he knew without asking permission to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, tell stories and
Tell
not
stories.
teach. Yeah, yeah.
No teaching. No.
Yes. Yeah.
No.
Well, I guess we both agree, that the world is getting ever worse, in many ways. But there are some changing, like in philosophy, the current ideas in academia, and probably also in society. It looks like there are some new currents coming up, emphasizing what I can see in your, for instance, the interview in Sun, where you talk about diversity and so on. Some kind of a resistance against the terrible mechanical worldview that has been dominating. That we are probably, hopefully, experiencing some revolt against the mechanical worldview.
Well, amen. If that's the case, amen. But I would put it to you this way. I think what I said is so, and what you saying is so. They're both so. They don't argue against each other. I think the forces that are at play now,
Yeah.
the internationalist or globalizing forces that are at play, they don't obey moral orders. They don't obey national governments. They don't obey Kyoto Accords and Paris Accords. You see, they're not the least bit interested, concerned, devoted to. They have no moral conscience. They have no historical memory. These things are kind of strange life forms unto themselves.
Yeah.
Where the boards of directors are only responsible to their shareholders, but not to the world, and so on and so on. Well, these things, they will not stop because people are being bothered by the fact that IKEA is everywhere on the planet. I'm bothered by that. We don't need IKEA all over the damn place, but it's a very good example of it. But Monsanto is a much darker example of it.
Yeah.
You see, and then the technologically enabled intrusion into every individual person's life. Here's a good example.
Yeah.
When the Normans, your ancestors, conquered England, my ancestors, in 1066. Within 2 or 3 years, the Norman nobles sent out into the countryside teams of, basically they were accountants. And what they did was they went to every farm, every house, every town and village, and they literally counted everything.
The Domesday Book.
Yeah. Exactly right, the Domesday Book. Okay, so I'm telling you that that's what Google is now.
Oh yeah.
Google, Amazon, right? YouTube, the internet. Obviously, these things they're the drones. They're the real drones.
Yeah.
And they're already there. And they're already counting everything. But they're counting your behaviors too, in a way the Domesday Book never did. They're counting your habits. They're counting the way you speak, how you buy, etc., and so on. So the real revolution today would be opting out of that stuff and refusing to be counted, by which I mean refusing to act and behave predictably. That you would have to challenge all your own habits of thinking and seeing and speaking and buying and eating and so on, reading, all of that, and your willingness to not have a consistent life that way could be your revolution.
Yeah.
And if that's what's happening, I suppose I'm all for it. And if I'm in small way responsible for encouraging that, I'm very glad, because I think in my way, I'm probably doing something similar, which is what you noticed when you mentioned it doesn't seem to be consistent with the standard sort of thinking patterns that that we've inherited in our intellectual tradition. This is because it's my understanding that our willingness to be consistent with yesterday is what's making Amazon the richest and most powerful presence beyond most national governments, that it's quickly becoming, and it's answerable to nobody.
Yeah. So the revolutionary word is probably turn unpredictable, become unpredictable.
But you have to do it ongoingly. You see, if you do it for a short period of time, then your unpredictability becomes predictable.
Yes. Oh yeah, sure, yeah.
Because all you're doing is saying yes when you used to say no. It becomes very predictable after a while.
Yeah.
So what I mean is the revolution could be something closer to this: that you become a practitioner of ambivalence instead of certainty. That you're no longer addicted to the desire to be clear, to be consistent, to be easily understood. Yeah. So I know something about this because I stand in front of audiences all over the world.
Yeah.
And I risk the possibility of being misunderstood constantly, consistently, and deeply. And oftentimes with great personal attack and all that kind of thing. And I continue to do interviews like this because I'm not arguing with anybody. You know, I'm not selling something. I'm simply trying to be the one I'm trying to find.
Mm-hmm. Being a kind of a guerrilla warfare against predictability or something. Yeah.
But I should not agree with you that that's what it is, because anybody who's listening will turn that into something recognizable. So to be real revolutionary, I should say to you, no, that's not true at all. But between you and me, that's true.
Yeah.
Don't tell anybody though.
No, I won't tell anyone. You know, when I was, and that's one thing I was going to end with asking you about, your views of Iceland and your experiences with Iceland, and whether you know anything about the hydrodam issues up in Árneshrepur.
Yes, I do.
You know all about that?
Well, not all about it, but I've been up there. I've been up there three or four times now.
Yeah, a lot is going on right now, and we will update you when you get here.
Yes.
But there was one thing. I've been very active in this resistance, trying to help out, and I was also pretty active in the struggle against the big hydrodam in the east called Kárahnjúkar, a huge hydroplant for an aluminium smelter. And that was really a disgusting project. And then one of our best writers, Andri Snær Magnason, his mind is very unpredictable. He wrote a wonderful book called The Dreamland. I don't know if you ran into it, but it has been translated into English.
Okay.
He was analyzing the heavy industry policy. And he said the politicians, they are always trying to prevent a catastrophe. They want to create jobs in order to prevent a catastrophe, of unemployment and so on, depopulation of the countryside and so on. And so then it struck my mind, that talking about death, that this is a kind of a latent fear of death. Wouldn't you think so?
It's as you describe it.
Yeah.
Yes, sure. This is part of why I say, no matter what we do, a certain amount of this stuff is going to happen regardless. You know,
Yeah.
the the I mean, first of all, I should say, as a Canadian, I'm ashamed that a Canadian resource exploitation company is behind this dam in Arnersrepper. It's so
Yeah.
despicable, and I mean, it's not bad enough that we do it here, and then we export this darkness to other places. You
Yeah.
know, that's the first thing, and then second of all, well, you know, if we were willing, okay, I'll say it differently. I remember that there was a French general in charge of the NATO forces in God knows where. Let's say it's Iran in the early days, but I can't really recall. So they were interviewing him as he was leaving and handing on his command to somebody else. And he
Mm-hmm.
said, and so the interviewer said to him, "So how do you think you did? How did we do on this mission?" And he said, "Well, in many ways of adding it up, we did pretty well." He said, "But I'm afraid that we in some way betrayed the soldiers that we were responsible to." And the interviewer said, "How did you do that?" And he said, "Well, we trained them how to kill, and we trained them very well, but we didn't train them how to die."
All right. Yes. Yeah.
And of course, if you're going to situations of armed conflict, some of you are going to die,
Yeah. Yeah.
but that's never in the training.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so here's another example apropos of the dam. So I was in Wales maybe 3 weeks ago, and way out in the countryside, and probably on a clear day from where I was, I could have seen you. I was facing in that direction,
Yeah.
and they had the council of that area. They owned some farms that the families could no longer keep and couldn't pay their taxes. So the local government took possession or ownership of the farms, and then quietly, without telling anybody, they took these farms, which are 1,000 years old or older,
Mm-hmm.
and began to try to find buyers for these farms. But of course, they're not looking to sell them to farmers. Well, of course not. They're looking to sell them to developers.
Oh yes. Yes.
And so they're selling these farms behind, without the awareness of the people who elected them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So they knew I was in the town because we'd had a show the night before, and they asked me would I come and talk to these farmers who were beginning to enact demonstrations against the selling of this farm and so on. So this is enormous responsibility. You go, and we sat down in a circle, and there's maybe 20 farmers of various ages, but the young guys they were angry, but they were scared. The old guys, well, they seemed more defeated than anything else, like they'd seen it all and there was nothing to be done and so on. And then they just said to me, "Could you say something to us about the situation?" Oh man. So I said, "Well, look," I said, you know, "it's not proper for somebody from another place to come and tell you in any way what he thinks you should do.
Mm-hmm.
But I could observe this on behalf of us all. If you are not willing to fight on behalf of this farm, knowing that you're going to fail, because the powers against you right now are stronger than you are,
Mm-hmm.
and they're more well organized than you are, and they have more money than you have, and nobody from the city who would buy this thing could give a damn about your concern for 1,000-year-old farm,
Mm-hmm.
because they have enough money from the sale of their house to buy this place several times over and turn it into what they want, a fantasy."
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, because they've no interest in the food, no interest in the history, no interest in old Wales, even though they themselves are Welsh. So I'm simply pleading with you to think it this way. You have to fight on behalf of this farm, knowing that you will fail. But you must learn from your failure enough to be able to mobilize and get out in front of these guys next time, and not wait to find this out and then talk about laying down in front of the tractor and making them kill you and all of that kind of thing. It's understandable. And I'm glad some of you are very angry, because this makes me angry too as an outsider. But for all of that, the real mature anger has to engage the possibility of failure. Failure in the immediate sense, you see, in the temporary sense of the word, that you're not going to see the fruit of your revolution and be a revolutionary at the same time. I don't think so. So it's our responsibility, I think, to mobilize on behalf of something we won't live long enough to see. That's what I mean by failure. You know, that's a different kind of courage, I guess you could say. And that's what I think we owe young people. And we owe these 1,000-year-old farms, whether it's in Wales or up where you were, Arnisrepper. And when we began to speak, I think I mentioned to you that I'd been to Iceland a couple of times, and I'd been recognized by this family of all these old men who were all brothers. And I look very much like them. And well, it's the brothers that are concerned with this dance.
The Drunkard brothers, yeah.
Exactly.
I'm learning to know these guys, you know. So.
Yeah. Well, I was there last year, and we taught, the story Beowulf.
Yeah.
I taught Beowulf in my school up in the community center in that village.
Yes.
And I had one of the Drunkard brothers carve for me from old driftwood one carving of Thor, one carving of Odin.
Yeah.
Big ones. And they were beside me for 6 days while I was teaching all this stuff. Yeah. And then when we were finished, we brought them up to the farm up there and faced them in the direction of where this dam is supposed to go. Yeah. Because maybe there's even a little bit of consequence to the direction that these carvings face. And look what's happened recently. Very mysterious, no?
Yeah.
They're working. Suddenly, somebody realizes it's the wrong map, and
oh yes.
All of that situation. So as long as you're willing to be mystified, then you can be courageous.
Yes. What you just said, it resounds actually with two of my favorite writers. One of them is an American poet of Icelandic descent, poet and essayist. He once wrote an essay called "The Music of Failure."
Wow.
And I'm not gonna recap that for you now, but I might try to make copy it for you, so you can have it when you get here. I don't have an extra copy of the book, but it's a wonderful American essay, and he always idealized Iceland. You know, his name was Bill Holm.
He was he's from Minnesota.
Yes, Minnesota.
Sure.
Yeah. The other poet was Stefán G. Stefánsson, who was an Icelandic immigrant in Canada, and I wrote his biography.
Oh.
And his greatest poem is called "Evening," and that's about the idea that you won't see the results of your struggles. You won't live that long, but you can, in a way, comfort yourself with the idea that things will move a little bit forward, so.
Well, there's another piece of comfort too that goes along with that.
Yeah.
It's the one I didn't mention before. It's true that we won't see the fruits of our labor, but we are the heirs of the fruits of the labor of the people who preceded us.
Yes.
So it's not exactly that we don't get anything out of the deal.
Sure.
It's their example, the revolutionary example, that gives us an instinct of how to proceed now, even though the circumstances are different and in some respects seemingly darker than before. But for all of that, we're on the receiving end of a certain kind of immense willingness to be human in the face of modern forces that are deeply, deeply inhuman. We didn't invent that. We received that from our predecessors. And that's in turn what we get to do for the people who come after us. So So it's just important to mention that we're not doing without eating at all. But we are eating what the old people planted.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Much of my scholarly work is trying to dig up from archives, from old manuscripts, some stuff that has never been included in the idealized pictures of the past, I want to get some other voices, from the past than those that have been idealized in the official cultural history,
Right.
So now we've been talking for over an hour, so maybe that should be it.
Okay.
I think we could discuss endlessly, but I really look forward to have you here, and I will be up in Árneshrepur, in a week from now, I guess. Okay. Close, yeah. So I really look forward to see you, and thank you very, very much for this interview. Thank you.
Good to have met you.
Yeah, great to talk to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you too. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.